In the blood-soaked chronicles of English justice, there exists a punishment so horrifying, so methodically cruel, that even centuries later, it stirs the soul with revulsion: death by boiling. Imagine the scene, not of a swift sword strike or a noose's final jerk, but of a man lowered into a cauldron of water, the heat creeping slowly, agonizingly into his skin. Flames licked the sides of the iron pot, not to cook food, but to consume human life in front of a watching crowd. This was no tale from medieval superstition or distant barbarism. This was the deliberate creation of a king, Henry VIII, who made suffering part of his theater of power. This was England, 1531, a nation trembling beneath the weight of religious upheaval and royal paranoia. Henry had not merely severed ties with Rome, he had redefined the meaning of authority, placing himself above the Pope, above tradition, above even God's word as interpreted for centuries. In doing so, he isolated England spiritually and politically, surrounded by foreign enemies and internal dissenters. And in such a world, trust died early. Poison became the unseen sword, the ultimate betrayal. Anyone could be a threat. Anyone might slip something deadly into a goblet or stew pot. And so the king responded, not with caution, but with ferocity. He did not just change the law, he created a new kind of horror. The act for poisoning emerged as an instrument of spectacle and terror. Parliament, bound by obedience and fear, ratified it without struggle. Its language was chillingly direct. Anyone convicted of murder by poison would be boiled alive until dead. Slowly, visibly, and with full awareness, the punishment was not merely to kill, it was to terrify. It was to dominate the minds of those who would even whisper dissent. And it would be used only twice in England's long history, not for its lack of approval, but for its unbearable inhumanity. The victims chosen were not kingslayers or conspirators. They were not soldiers of rebellion or agents of foreign crowns. They were people who, in another life, might have remained invisible: a household cook named Richard Roose and a young servant girl, Margaret Davy. Both were accused of the same crime, poisoning, and both met the same fate in the cauldrons of Smithfield. Richard Roose's story begins not in shadowy treachery, but in the warmth of a kitchen, in the home of Bishop John Fisher, a man soon to become a martyr of conscience. Roose, like many of his station, was trusted to feed not just the body, but the spirit of the house. His porridge on a February day seemed ordinary, but that night bodies convulsed. 17 fell violently ill, 2 died, the cause poison, and suspicion swept like fire through the bishop's kitchen. Roose was seized, interrogated with all the blunt tools of Tudor justice, and condemned. Whether he had acted alone or been coerced, bribed, or betrayed remains buried in history's silence. His confession came after brutal questioning. And once it came, there was no stopping what followed. The execution was not merely public, it was planned as performance. A cauldron was crafted for the occasion, large enough to swallow a man whole. Wood was gathered, chains prepared. On the cold day of execution, London gathered with grim anticipation. Roose, shackled and pale, was led to the scaffold. There was no last-minute pardon, no mercy from the court. He was lowered into water that was at first merely warm. Then the fire was lit. The agony came not as a moment but a progression, slow, torturous, consuming. And with each rising degree, the crowd's excitement faded to horror. Women fainted. Men turned away. What began as justice became something far darker. A decade later, the cauldron was unearthed again, this time for Margaret Davy, a girl barely older than childhood accused of the same crime. Her hands, which had scrubbed and served, now allegedly mixed poison into her master's food. The trial was swift, the evidence paper thin. Fear had become enough to damn. She was terrified, broken by interrogation. Her youth did not save her. In 1542, Margaret was dragged to Smithfield. Her cries pierced the morning chill, but the flames beneath the iron did not falter. The water boiled, and so did she. But Margaret's execution hit differently. The crowd, hardened by years of spectacle, could not stomach what they saw. It was no longer justice. It was a warning too cruel to be ignored. People fled. Observers turned their backs. Religious men who once preached fire and brimstone could not summon the words to justify it. Something had shifted. A line had been crossed. And the ripples did not stop at Smithfield. Abroad, England's name was spoken with disgust. Diplomats found themselves defending the indefensible. At home, even the legal men, the judges, the scribes, began to question what they had enabled. Costly, ineffective, morally shattering. Boiling served no deterrent purpose. Poisonings did not cease. But something else was born. Doubt, and doubt, once seated in the foundations of tyranny, grows into resistance. By 1547, the king who had authored this horror was dead, and his law, which had terrorized through heat and spectacle, was repealed. Quietly, efficiently, the cauldrons were melted, the platforms dismantled. No ceremony, no apology, just erasure. As if even the state wished to forget what it had once demanded. But memory is not so easily boiled away. The screams of Roose and Margaret echoed beyond the square. They lived in the hearts of those who saw, in the records of those who wrote, in the teachings of those who came after. Ballads were whispered, not sung. Sermons offered mercy, not fire. The legal scholars who trained future judges began using these cases not as precedents, but as warnings. The scars left on the national soul would shape England's legal journey for centuries. Boiling alive became a symbol not of justice, but of how far justice could fall when corrupted by fear, by absolute power, and by the terrifying belief that cruelty could preserve order. What the king had tried to showcase as strength became a monument to tyranny's failure. And yet this story, this chapter in crimson ink, is not over. Because the questions remain. Why did Henry VIII believe fear would build loyalty? How did ordinary citizens come to accept the unacceptable? What other punishments lingered just one act of paranoia away from reality? These questions stretch beyond the Tudor court and into the heart of human governance. What are we willing to do in the name of safety? How quickly does law become violence? Justice become vengeance? The story does not end in 1547, nor with the melted cauldrons, because fear still lives in the hearts of rulers. Paranoia still shapes policy, and even today the line between justice and spectacle is thinner than we like to admit. This tale continues, not in boiling water, but in every debate about punishment and power, in every law passed out of fear, in every silence where dissent should speak. And so the story flows onward, as England, though no longer under Henry's rule, carried forward the weight of his choices like a lingering illness beneath the surface of legal order. Edward VI's reign, youthful and brief, did not have the strength nor the cruelty of his father's iron fist, but the shadows of Henry's legacy loomed large over every law passed, every courtroom decision, and every hushed conversation in the halls of justice. The repeal of the boiling law may have silenced the cauldrons, but it had not yet healed the nation. Margaret Davy's name, whispered in taverns and behind church pews, became a cautionary tale not only of royal cruelty, but of how quickly innocence could become expendable in the name of peace. Children heard the stories, but not as bedtime tales. These were warnings, unwritten lessons passed down in fear: never speak out, never step beyond your station, never forget the reach of power. Even as Edward's advisors moved to moderate the excesses of Henry's reign, they did so with wary hands. The same judges who once condemned Roose now shuffled their parchments and avoided public scrutiny. The executioners who had watched flesh blister and bones split in scalding water returned to ordinary duties, hanging thieves, branding forgers. But they never quite escaped the ghosts that clung to their memories. One man, it was said, took to drink and confessed in a half-empty church that he still heard Margaret's cries in his sleep. Another simply vanished, never to be seen again. In the legal schools, where young minds trained to uphold justice, the boiling law was dissected in cold terms. An anomaly, a legislative misstep, an unfortunate byproduct of political necessity. But beneath the scholarly language lay a deeper tension. How does a society that permits such horror explain itself afterward? Can a nation that once celebrated boiling flesh in public squares ever truly say it values justice? These were questions few dared speak aloud, yet they lingered in the air like the acrid smoke of a long-dead fire. Parliament, still wary of Henry's ghost, began to edge toward reform. Torture remained unofficial but tolerated. Executions were still public, still brutal, but less theatrical than before. The gallows remained busy, but the appetite for novelty had dulled. The scars left by the boilings had taught an uneasy lesson. When the public is forced to become spectator to such intimate suffering, even the most obedient subjects begin to recoil. Beyond London, in the countryside, stories of Roose and Davy took on the shape of legend. In Kent, it was said that a kitchen boy refused to cook stew on a feast day, fearing what might become of him. In Wiltshire, villagers claimed a woman once boiled her husband's shirt in protest, muttering Margaret's name under her breath. Superstition, history, and trauma became inseparable. The past had stained the future. Yet for all the horror these executions inspired, there remained a strain of admiration in some corners of power, not for the method, but for the control, the clarity of authority, the silence that followed. There were those, nobles, magistrates, secret whispers, who saw in Henry's law a kind of terrible genius. One stroke of the pen, and a nation was frozen in fear. Could such obedience ever be achieved without such force? These thoughts, dangerous as they were, survived like coals buried in ash. When times of crisis returned, as they always do, these old ideas could rise again. Already, whispers began to circulate in certain quarters. What if there were new threats, unseen, silent, like poison in porridge? What then would the law become? What new punishments would the state devise? The memory of Smithfield's boiling pits may have faded from the official record, but the scent of fear and control never truly left. The apparatus of tyranny is never fully dismantled. It simply sleeps, waiting for another monarch, another moment of panic, another law justified by the phrase, "for the safety of the realm." So the story continues, through reigns that follow and monarchs who wear different crowns but carry the same hunger for obedience. Through courtrooms where justice is weighed not in truth but in fear. Through generations that inherit stories whispered in fear and repeated in silence. The past never dies, it boils, beneath the surface, waiting. Shall I continue with the reign of Queen Mary and explore whether the flames of Smithfield gave rise to new forms of fear? Or would you prefer we follow the secret impact of these executions on England's emerging thinkers, reformers, or ordinary people who dared to remember when the law burned too hot? The death of young Edward VI in 1553, sickly and pale, extinguished before manhood, thrust England again into the turbulent current of dynastic ambition and religious unrest. And from those shadows emerged Mary Tudor, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, Henry VIII's first wife. Crowned Queen Mary I, she took the throne with the weight of vengeance pressing against her heart. Mary did not need Henry's boiling cauldrons. She had fire. Smithfield, once a place of grim spectacle where Richard Roose had screamed his last, was repurposed under Mary's rule into a furnace of religious conformity. Where her father had punished poisoners with scalding heat, Mary punished heretics with holy flame. The law shifted, the method evolved, but the message remained: disobedience will not be tolerated, not in this life or the next. From 1555 to 1558, nearly 300 Protestants were burned alive, a brutal cleansing Mary justified as a divine necessity. Among them were bishops, commoners, scholars, and even pregnant women. The executions were meticulously staged, straw soaked in tar, chained bodies propped upright, sermons echoing over the crackle of flesh. And just like in the days of Henry's boiling pots, the crowds came, not in joy, but in fascination. Horror and faith twined like smoke in their lungs. But what most did not know, what only whispered rumors and cautious scholars hinted at, was that Mary had not forgotten Margaret Davy. The boiling law her father enacted had been repealed, yes, but not expunged from her mind. Mary, after all, had watched as her own mother was cast aside, as Rome was severed from England. She had tasted the bitterness of betrayal and the slow erosion of justice under her father's whims. Margaret's story, retold in fragments across years, became for Mary both a reminder and a lesson that justice in the hands of a monarch is not bound by law, it is law. Privately, Mary expressed disdain for the vulgarity of boiling executions, but she never condemned them. In her chambers, she kept a small volume of her father's legal decrees. Not all queens need fire to rule, she once told her confessor, but some must be seen lighting the match. Where Henry had silenced threats with spectacle, Mary sought to cleanse the soul of England through purification by fire. She saw Protestantism not just as dissent, but as poison. The echoes of Richard Roose's crime came back in metaphor. Heresy was treason of the soul, and like poison and porridge, it must be purged from the body of the nation. Not boiled, perhaps, but burned to ash. And so, in a chilling twist, Smithfield became both cauldron and altar, a place where sinners were consumed not by oil but by flame. And in the minds of many, the distinction hardly mattered. But while the burnings were public, Mary's deeper fears were private. In the final years of her reign, she became obsessed with rumors that some of those who had once supported her father's boiling laws were conspiring in her court. Men who had seen too much, who still believed in fear as a governing tool. She had them watched, questioned, and in some cases, disappeared. Her phantom pregnancy in 1555, when she believed herself with child only to be proven mistaken, was interpreted by her closest confidants as a divine punishment. Some believed her womb had withered not from age, but from guilt. Others claimed she was cursed by the spirit of Margaret Davy, whose innocence still cried out for vengeance. When Mary died in 1558, England exhaled, but not in relief. The nation had simply survived another chapter of its own cruelty. The fires were extinguished, but the embers remained. Elizabeth I would ascend the throne and bring stability, but even she, brilliant, calculating, fierce, would inherit a kingdom that had forgotten how to bleed slowly. It only knew extremes, and beneath it all, the people remembered. Not just the burnings, not just the cauldrons, but the silence that followed. Because history, in England, was no longer merely written, it was felt. Shall I now carry the story into Elizabeth's golden reign, to show how even the Virgin Queen used the memory of fire to sculpt loyalty, or perhaps trace how the myth of boiling executions survived in folk tales, theater, and literature? So ends this chapter of England's cruel ingenuity, where fear was law, and law was weaponized through fire, oil, and divine justification. From Henry VIII's boiling cauldrons to Mary I's purifying flames, the Tudor dynasty carved its authority not only in stone or scripture, but in the flesh of its people. The execution of Richard Roose, the boiling of Margaret Davy, and the burnings at Smithfield were not isolated acts of violence. They were signals, calculated messages from the throne to the masses. They whispered, shouted, and finally screamed, "The crown does not bleed, it only punishes." These were not punishments of necessity, but of demonstration. They turned public spaces into theaters of obedience, where pain became a tool and spectacle the sermon. And though the cauldrons would cool and the pyres would burn out, their shadows lengthened over generations. The smell of boiling fat and burning bone faded, but the memory of fear became part of England's cultural marrow. In time, the laws would soften, torture would be denounced, executions would retreat behind prison walls. But the lesson learned in those brutal years endured. True power is not merely held, it is felt in the trembling silence that follows unspeakable acts. And perhaps most chilling of all is this: the apparatus that allowed such horrors was not broken. It was simply put away, waiting for a time of fear, for a leader who, like Henry, saw mercy as weakness, and cruelty, because history does not only remember. Sometimes it repeats.